So this talk's called T.H. Huxley's Subversive Pupil, William Saville-Kent, Pioneer of Australian Marine Sustainability. During the inaugural address of the International Fisheries Exhibition of 1883 in London, a minor organiser called William Saville-Kent had occasion to listen to his mentor, Royal Society President Thomas Henry Huxley. And Huxley was telling the assembled experts that all attempts to regulate fisheries were useless and unnecessary. Nothing we can do seriously affects the number of fish, he thundered, pointing to the findings of 2 royal commissions in proof. They confirmed Huxley's view that the fishing stocks of the world's oceans were simply inexhaustible. And Huxley was a formidable person to defy, the man known as Darwin's bulldog. On the surface, William Saville-Kent had every reason to agree with his mentor, for his career at that particular moment stood in acute jeopardy, and he desperately needed his patron's good opinion. Though few except William himself knew it, his sister, Constance Kent, was soon to complete a 22-year prison sentence, during which time her wax effigy had been displayed at Madame Tussauds as the most notorious murderess of the age. In 1860, at the age of 15, she cut the throat of her 3.5-year-old brother, Francis. But detectives suspected that her subsequent confession in 1865 was an act of martyrdom to protect her beloved younger brother, William Saville-Kent. Well, William Kent, as he was known then. The 2 children had been driven to this grisly act in revenge against their father, Samuel, and their stepmother, Mary Ann, at whose hands they and their late mother had experienced incredible cruelties. Constance had always encouraged her brother's secret aspirations to become a scientist. She'd even introduced him at the age of 13, when she was 13, to Darwin's Origin of Species, which she procured in its year of publication and read at school and brought home and told her parents and her brother that she was a convert to evolution. Her confession, too, in 1865, which earned her a sentence of death and commuted to 22 years in prison, had helped her brother gain a small inheritance to fulfill his dream of becoming a scientist. He'd repaid her during those 22 years with a selfish cruelty that matched his father. He'd ignored all her written pleas to help, visit, and write. And now she was about to get out of prison, and there was no knowing how this angry young woman would respond to the treacherous brother to whom he owed his life, his freedom, and his career. No wonder her prospective release loomed for him like a time bomb. Despite her sacrifice and William's own considerable talent, William Saville-Kent, as he now calls himself, a kind of deliberate change of name, had also managed to mess up a promising scientific career. True, in opting to become a professional scientist, he'd not chosen an easy path. Oxbridge clergymen, steeped in the creationist tenets of the Church of England, still monopolised most paid scientific positions in England, though not necessarily in Scotland. Fortunately for William, his drive for a career in science coincided with social reforms that were beginning to pave the way for new modes of scientific professionalism. Inspired by Charles Darwin's example and led by the pugnacious Thomas Huxley, young men, almost exclusively from the middling ranks, were beginning to storm the religious bastions. Huxley urged them to overthrow clerical and aristocratic privilege so as to bring about a new reformation, as he called it, based on secular and morally uplifting scientific careers. Now, even though William Kent's early education had been spotty and erratic, thanks largely to his father, he managed to enrol in evening classes at King's College London, where he attended Huxley's inspirational lectures on marine biology. Having caught the great man's eye, he was encouraged to work for a period with Huxley's very close friend William Flower at the Royal College of Surgeons, cataloguing their coral collections and becoming smitten with these mysterious creatures. By 1870, William, aged 25, was a published authority on corals and sponges, working as a junior assistant at the British Museum. Yet he shared his father's restless social ambition and soon began to chafe at the poor pay and lack of promotion opportunities. Over the next 7 years, his impatience to succeed led him to cultivate a succession of alternative scientific patrons. In each case, though, his prickly, wounded personality overshadowed his genuine abilities. After a succession of ructions, mostly ending up with him being sacked, chastened William had no choice but to rejoin Professor Huxley's overcrowded patronage train. He enrolled in Huxley's comparative anatomy course at Imperial College, dedicated a 3-volume manual of the Infusoria to him, and in 1880 obtained a position working with him in the government's fisheries department. He also began urgently lobbying Huxley to secure him work abroad as the time for his sister to leave prison got closer. And he tried to get a job in New York, but in late 1883 he had to take a kind of second option, which is obtaining a senior position in faraway Tasmania as supervisor of the state's fisheries. Well, William arrived in Hobart in July 1884 with 2 aims. He hoped to fulfil his blocked scientific ambitions and to escape the weight of his dark past. In the short term, neither aim succeeded. On leaving prison, Constance Kent promptly followed her brother out to Australia under an assumed name. At the same time, his fisheries position in Hobart quickly proved problematic. The Salmon Commissioners, a political lobby group with gentry pretensions, saw his main task as being to confirm their acclimatisation in Tasmania of British salmon, the noble fish. William concluded, however, that the much vaunted salmon trophies of eminent figures such as the Governor of Tasmania were in fact simply overgrown specimens of European and American trout. The royal salmon, he said, had failed to acclimatise because of the warm local waters. William's blunt publicising of this opinion would eventually cost him his job. He'd anyway arrived in the colony with a fisheries program that was far too visionary for the faux gentlemen of the Salmon Commission. In fact, it would have been far too visionary for Thomas Henry Huxley as well. While working as a research advisor in the 1870s to a series of new commercial aquaria, he began in Brighton and in London, he began to experiment with culturing certain types of fish and also of seafood, as it was in effect. He began to conduct experiments in the artificial culturing of marine species for which the demand was outstripping the supply already in the UK. A systematic review in Hobart of local fishery conditions convinced him that the same problems had arisen there. He thus set about creating a research station to study and culture declining marine species. And he built this to his design on government land at Battery Point, and it boasted a laboratory, saltwater hatcheries and aquaculture facilities. And here he developed methods for culturing oysters and lobsters and helped local fishermen to cultivate and market indigenous fish and crayfish. In his spare time, he wrote papers advocating these ideas to Tasmania's Royal Society, an action that fueled the Salmon Commissioner's gripes that he was too academic for the inspector's job, which was to affirm the royal salmon. By late 1887, however, William was at least partially successful in his other aim. He seems at least to have achieved some kind of secret rapprochement with Constance. I think, and we cannot, her first 4 years in Australia are a complete blank, and quite deliberately. She came out here under a false name of Emily Kay, which you can find on the shipping records, but she disappears for 4 years. During that time, I'm pretty certain that she shared William's Hobart house under that name, and then later also joined him in Brisbane. But at the same time, his fisheries position was becoming increasingly vexed. He worked for a time in Victoria, but that contract expired. He failed to get a job in New South Wales because a rival was given it. He felt himself to be, and of course he was sacked and not reappointed by the fisheries, by the Salmon Commission in Tasmania. So he was in an acutely difficult situation. Thankfully for him, at the dawning of Australia's centenary year, 1888, a sudden change of luck. The Queensland government asked him to report on their oyster sites in Moreton Bay, and he was invited to join the HMS Myrmidon on a pioneering survey of the Cambridge Gulf in northwest Australia. With alacrity, as William said, he grabbed this chance to escape his troubles and to explore a tropical region largely unknown to science at that time. The survey proved to be a turning point in his scientific fortunes, at least in Australia. His Gulf collections impressed some of Queensland's most senior scientists. He won favour with the Queensland Museum by offering them 67 species of molluscs and an even more substantial collection of birds and reptiles, including some unknown to science which were named after him. Reporting these discoveries in a paper to the Congress of the Australian Advancement of Science in 1889 earned him an invitation to join the Queensland Royal Society, and a month later to become the Society's next chairman, so he'd arrived. News of these triumphs also added weight to a proposal for a full-time job that William had dashed off to the Premier of Queensland, Sir Thomas McElrea, just before joining the Myrmidon. His timing was perfect. Queensland's rival Conservative leaders, McElrath and Sir Samuel Griffin, were joining political forces to do something about the alarming depletion of the state's marine resources. All the barrier reef marine industries, including the lucrative pearl shell trade, had been producing falling returns because of overfishing and the depredations of Japanese and Taiwanese luggers, which they just simply couldn't control. New licensing regulations of 1881 had failed to check the decline in any way. By March 1889, even the Torres Strait pearlers themselves were pressing for restrictions on the harvesting of immature pearl shell, which is something that they'd been doing consistently themselves up to that point. In that month, the Queensland government offered William Saville-Kent a 3-year full-time position as Commissioner of North Australian Fisheries on a good salary. He travelled up to Brisbane, accompanied by his wife Mary Ann and another unnamed member of his family, very likely Constance. Freed at last from fears of unemployment and of potential exposure as a murderer, William soon also discovered a refuge from worldly cares in the remote islands of the Torres Strait, a melting pot and a marine frontier where he could ease the shackles of his stiff and wounded personality. After the Tasmanian fiasco, he was keen to demonstrate his value, his economic value as a marine scientist and resource manager. Having undertaken an extensive review of Queensland's fishing industries, he concluded that a redemption of the edible oyster and pearl shell industries was urgently needed. The Torres Strait pearling industry, normally one of Queensland's leading revenue producers, had become so exhausted that most of the harvested shell was now too small even for Japanese button manufacturers. So it had really become, it had lost its economic value altogether. William was an expert at artificial cultivation methods, but nobody had yet invented a way of doing this for wild pearl shell. And most of the region's shallow pearl shell beds were exhausted, and the remaining deep sea beds were so far out to sea they couldn't be protected from plunderers. Also extremely difficult to get the deep diving. Veteran pearlers claimed to him that transferring immature oysters to shallow water would never work because severing their abysses, their anchor cables, would cause them to just drift away on the currents and die. Luggermen also advised him that the young oysters would perish in transit even before that, so they'd die getting them out of the water and to the shallow beds. Between 1889 and 1891, William made 3 extended stays in the Torres Straits to tackle these problems. I have to say, just as an aside, he showed he was his father's son too in his amorous escapades during this time, but that's another story. Enthusiastic support from 2 of the region's most influential Europeans made his task a good deal easier. Frank Jardine was an adventurer leading pearler from Somerset near the Albany Passage, and John Douglas was official resident at Thursday Island. And both helped William to visit the deep sea, to visit and procure young immature shell from the deep sea grounds, and to collect abundant samples of these immature deep shells. And then Jardine provided sites at Somerset for his oyster transplantation experiments, where he used giant clam shells as portable aquaria, which is a very, very sensible thing to do. He also discovered that a series of shallow rock pools near John Douglas's residency offered current-washed environments perfect for oyster growth, and also protectable from any plunderers. To his delight, the transplanted pearl oysters adapted themselves with alacrity to the novel environment, as he said. They grew new abysses, large enough to resist the currents, until they got to such a point where their own weight was enough to keep them anchored. And in one 6-week period, most of his young oysters recorded an astonishing ½ an inch of shell growth in this protected and kind of ocean-washed environment. William also recommended a searching program of industry reforms, a 3-year moratorium of pearling in Endeavour Strait to replenish oyster stock, bans on the sale of shell less than 6 inches in internal diameter, and a scheme to lease out banks, foreshores, reefs and shore stations around the strait for the transfer and cultivation of immature shell. And in 1891, the Pearl Shell and Bêche de Mer Fisheries Act of 1881 was amended to include all of William's suggestions. He also introduced an inspector program. By the way, his father was a factory inspector, so there's quite a lot of analogy between the process of factory inspecting in England and the use of this cultivation program in Australia. Investigating a variety of edible oyster shell beds at the southern end of the reef around Wide Bay, Mackay and Cooktown also fostered his zeal for artificial cultivation. He thought the life of a North Queensland oyster farmer to be a perfect Elysium, and we discussed this yesterday, whether it was a recipe for happiness or not. In no other country in the world, he wrote, is so healthy, congenial and non-laborious a means of earning a substantial competency open to all classes. The problem of losing a high percentage of free-swimming oyster embryos, or spat, at sea could be overcome, he demonstrated, by building split paling collectors on which they could cling, and he was responsible for promoting this kind of split pale collector. But William also saw himself as much more than an economic biologist. He fell in love with the reef. It transformed his personality, and it transformed his actions from then on. Indeed, I would argue in some ways that it redeemed him at some point, but we'll come to that. He fell in love with the reef because the region's intertidal areas and lime-saturated coral seas offered, he said, one of the most active and visibly effective of nature's petrological laboratories. Thursday Island, he said at that time, was a site unequalled in the world for the study of tropical biology, particularly given that there was so little was known about the character and behaviour of tropical coral types. The famous British Challenger expedition of 1872 had collected 61 species of Australian corals. William discovered over 70 different species of madrepores alone. He was, I think, an instinctive ecologist, even though perhaps not one that we would formally recognise today. He did carefully map the distinct combinations of coral types at different reef locations. He noticed, for example, that staghorns dominated at Port Denison reefs, bush-like clumps of Millipora at Palm Island, mushroom corals off at Dolphus Island, and leathery bright green alconarians at Thursday Island. Reef corals, he noted too, I think, importantly, proved more protean than most zoologists realised. The colours, he noted, often varied among separate colony stocks of the same species, and even within different growth epochs of the same colony. And this is the kind of foundation of Charlie Barron's work on the environmental influence of corals in their evolution. This implied local environmental adaptations. The same conclusion, I say here, that would much later lead to Charlie Barron's theory of the reticulate evolution of corals. Non-coral species, he noticed, also made a key contribution to reef building. Nullipore seaweeds with lime-encrusted tissues, shells of minute protozoa, and the skeletons of sea urchins, starfish, trepang, all these contributed to the lime cement and conglomerate that built reefs. Measuring the speed of coral growth also suddenly assumed a dramatic significance on the 28th of February 1890, when a large passenger steamer, the Quetta, hit a submerged coral pinnacle in a well-charted area of the barrier reef of the Torres Strait between Albany and Adolphus Island. It sank in 3 minutes with a loss of around half of its 182 passengers and crew. Asked to investigate the site, William concluded that the coral pinnacle had grown to become an unmarked hazard during the 30 years since the last survey. Accurate studies of coral growth rates, thus in different environments, now became an urgent imperative for navigation, let alone scientific interest. William also advocated the need for marine biologists to use photography as a tool for the scientific study of reefs and their inhabitants. He'd been impressed by the marine photographs of a local policeman during the Myrmidon expedition, and his wife Mary Ann had given him a modest camera, which proved transformative, I think, both of his psyche and of his science, and I haven't got time to go into all that. In a pre-scuba world, living corals were rarely seen. It's important to understand that, except perhaps during spring tides, low spring tides in places like the reef, where the corals were laid bare, and William Saville-Kent photographed those corals. Fleeting periods of exposure at low spring tides became his way of recording the existence and the patterns of corals. He was also, and this is again another aspect of the larger story, a very, very talented artist. So he painted the corals to get their colours in the black epoch. Provided one worked with great speed, you could, William boasted, reproduce corals with a fidelity that photography alone can compass, and that no pencil could equal. Photography, he argued, could reveal the geological structures of reefs, map the distribution and relationships of reef corals, and capture the exact likenesses of associated marine species, while still brimming with life in his giant clamshell aquarium. Most importantly, coral photographs could serve as precise records for measuring changes in coral growth and distribution over time. To achieve all this, a scientist photographer needed great patience and physical stamina, as well as technological virtuosity. Specialist equipment for scientific photography was almost non-existent. William had to devise his own square lens frame, as well as build an extra supporting leg on his tripods in order to take corals and crustacea from a vertical position. Wherever possible, he photographed marine creatures in his portable shell aquaria so as to replicate original environmental conditions as best he could and retain their true natural appearances. And we see him with little turtles climbing out of photographing little turtles climbing out of the clamshells. In the British autumn of 1893, after William had left Queensland in December 1891 to return to England at the urging of his wife Mary Ann, who hated Australia, he published a book that encapsulated these 4 magical years of work on the reef. Published by the elite press W.H. Allen, it was a large-sized production in super royal quarto with 48 whole-page photomezzotype black and white plates and 16 hand-coloured chromolithographic plates. And if I wasn't such a useless academic, I would have actually got you the pictures. I have them, but I just haven't had time to get them out. But his book, The Great Barrier Reef of Australia, its products and potentialities, took its many reviewers in Britain, Australia and the US actually by storm. It was hailed as the first complete biography of the reef, and William Saville-Kent's wounded sensibilities, his diverse talents and his frustrated ambitions came together, I believe, to create a masterpiece of art and of science. At a time when T.H. Huxley and Matthew Arnold were arguing heatedly about the gulf that was growing up between the two cultures of art and science, William showed how to bridge this divide. The West Australian proclaimed that the book was enough to make the scientific man an artist and the artist a scientist, and to inspire the ordinary reader with a desire to be both. Nature, the journal already on its way to becoming the most prestigious scientific journal of the Anglophone world, suggested that Saville-Kent's photographic methods had added something entirely new to the methodology of the scientist. His book contains a series of nature pictures of the corals, such as never before been submitted to the scientific world. A glance at his illustrations does more to familiarise one with the phases and aspects of the reef and its life than pages and pages of written descriptions. And every reviewer, without exception, and there are dozens of them, singled out the photographic illustrations and coloured drawings as the book's unique attraction, noting that most people in the Northern Hemisphere would have had no conception until now of the indescribable beauty and riotous colours of a coral reef and its marine inhabitants. Well, William Saville-Kent eventually died near Bournemouth of a blocked bowel, which is kind of fitting in a way, on 11th of October 1908. Few mourned the death of this prickly, difficult and wounded man. Yet his work was to be remembered and used as a baseline for reef coral and fisheries research for years to come. American biologist Alfred Mayer's pioneering Carnegie-funded ecological studies in the Torres Strait of 1913 were based in part on a desire to locate and measure the growth of some of William's Thursday Island corals. That's why he headed straight to Thursday Island, only to find most of them had already died from silting and pollution. And that, in fact, the Thursday Island was no longer a useful site for a marine laboratory, and he changed his mind and headed off to Murray Islands that were much, much more pristine. When Maurice Young became a very famous British coral scientist, was asked to lead a 12-month joint Cambridge Australian expedition to the Great Barrier Reef in 28-29, Saville-Kent's book was their Bible. None of the young British biologists who were on that expedition had ever seen a coral reef except in its pages. Just to conclude in 10 seconds, William might have been particularly pleased to know the identity of one of the Australian purchasers of his famous book. Under the alias of Emily Kay, his sister Constance, who'd become a revered Australian nursing sister and a matron. A woman who in her 100th year would receive a letter of congratulation from the Queen while her statue was still, her wax statue was still in Madame Tussauds, would die on the 10th of April 1944 in Strathfield, Sydney. Having worked in typhoid tents, a leper hospital and a reformatory school for girls, Constance can surely be said to have redeemed herself. If the reef could speak, perhaps it would say the same for Brother William. Thank you.